Hello and welcome to this videocast. My name is Dominic Orr and I'm Professor for Open Education at Gorica University in Slovenia. I'm also Research Lead at Kiron Open Higher Education. This is a learning platform where we help refugees and vulnerable groups through our learning office. We're in the midst of the corona crisis. So this is a replacement for a keynote I would have been holding at the Nexus conference on the 17th of March 2020 in Lausanne University in Germany. My topic is the future of higher education from the learner perspective. My short talk is largely based on a study I led while working for FIBS Research Institute in Berlin. If we look around us, we see that we are living in a world which is largely influenced by digitalization and by globalization. And these two things combined are really making the world figuratively spin faster. We can actually see the effects of this kind of interconnectivity through the prism of the coronavirus at this very moment. Within this context, higher education should be seen as being part of this world, which means it's affected by the environment it works in, but it also can have effects on the environment itself. In 2020, we can also look back on 20 years of the Bologna process. And I would like to call our attention to one of the foundational documents in the Bologna process, the so-called Sorbonne Declaration from 1998. In it, the declaration stated, "We are heading for a period of major change in education and working conditions, to a diversification of courses of professional careers, with education and training throughout life becoming a clear obligation. We owe our students and our society at large a higher education system in which they are given the best opportunities to seek and find their own area of excellence." I think this document could have been written last week. It's highly relevant, and this expectation on higher education is what we should be looking at. So what do we know about our students today? Well, based on the Eurostudent study, we know that over half of students work alongside their studies. The colleagues from Eurostudent did some further analysis and they found that exactly these working students still consider themselves primarily students who are working on the side. That accounts for 2/3 of those students, but a further 1/3 see their primary status the other way round. They understand themselves as people who are working and they are studying alongside their work. And I think this is particularly a group which we would expect to get bigger, and it's a group that really we have neglected very much in the past. If we now look at higher education, I think there are two limitations to higher education which we should revise currently. The first one is there's a huge difference between being in higher education and being outside of higher education. And we see this in the way enrollment is regulated, in our concept of when a course is finished, and in the way we consider these kind of blocks of programs. So I'm talking here about, for example, you enroll to a bachelor program and you consider to have finished your program when you graduate from this bachelor program. This comes on to my second limitation, which I think is important. It is that we often see learning as being very linear. You start something and you're expected to finish it in one kind of pathway, and very much many of the governance regulations we have also expect this to happen in a particular period of time. A number of years ago now, we were asked by the German government to formulate a concept for higher education in 2030. And I think when we first got this contract, it was very much the idea we were going to be focusing on digitalization. But no one really knows exactly what digitalization is going to look like. even tomorrow. And we can see that now with the coronavirus, that suddenly so many people are interested in digitalization and how that can have effect on learning. So what we did instead is we said, well, let's look at learning pathways and see if focusing on them helps us reimagine what higher education might look like. When we did that, we came to 4 models which we think could be specific pathways of learning which will be of ever more importance going up to 2030. For fun, but also for ease of recollection, we gave these 4 pathways toy names. They are Tamagotchi, Jenga, Lego, and Transformer. And I'm going to talk very briefly about them now. Firstly, Tamagotchi. This is the idea that higher education is about creating an ecosystem around the student, which is about supporting the student, but also by creating this kind of ecosystem around it. And I'm thinking here of, the classic study organization that I was just saying is a weakness of higher education. We're making these students very much dependent on those bigger decisions which are being made about what is a student, what is higher education. So we should maybe take a step away from this kind of concept, although I think it's very important, particularly at the beginning of studies, because it helps students understand what progress they could be making through higher education. If we take one step away, we come to our second model, which we call Jenga. With Jenga, we had the idea that, similar to the toy where you build a kind of a tower first, and then you start taking away bricks and you find the tower stays stable. Why can't we rethink of higher education like that? Let's take a classic bachelor program and see if we can take some pieces away from it, but still make sure this is a foundational program, which maybe only takes 2 years to do. And then these other pieces will then be offered maybe also by different educational providers, going forward in more flexible kind of modules, in the way that the student then can choose which modules do they want, which are most relevant to them at this particular moment. The interesting thing about this model is, of course, who is going to actually decide when the student is finished, how are we going to make sure that we get the right kind of recognition that still makes it useful for the student to have their study pathway broken up into these pieces. But I think it's this idea of let's focus on what is foundational and let's try and keep studies flexible enough for the labour market and society they want to be in. Another way of thinking about higher education, and I think this has been thought about a lot, we have called Lego. Lego takes a completely opposite view to higher education than the Tamagotchi model, because it says, let's start with what the student would like to learn. The student can gather the modules of learning that they find most interesting. These could be models which they learn on campus. They could be many online provisions. And the student themselves, they kind of build their own program of learning. We often see this actually happening in areas where we don't yet have classical studies. So it's happened a lot in the area of informatics. Let's say, what is a data scientist? So many people who are working in that kind of area are doing this kind of thing already with the various learning offers they can find out there. The interesting thing is here, we have to then think about how we're going to recognize the learning that has been done, how we're going to document it, and how we're going to make sure it's useful to the learner, and also how we're going to make sure that it's not too exclusive. Because if we've got this type of highly flexible studies, we also need better support of those students when they're making these kind of decisions. So their guidance becomes extremely central to this educational model. The final model we've called Transformer. We really think this is a model particularly for learners who are coming to higher education, maybe having worked for a number of years, maybe even 10 years or so in the labour market, or have been doing other things, maybe family duties. So they're coming back to education we've been working on this kind of model, I think, in higher education for the last 20 years. But we've often said, yes, let's make the entrance more open for this group, but we haven't thought very much didactically about it. This group brings in a whole raft of experience and also knowledge which we could be using within the studies. At the same time, this group is a group which needs some help, particularly at the beginning, because they've been away from formal education for such a time. So this is a model where we have to really think about the didactics. How can we provide enough support, but how can we also have enough flexibility to really benefit from these experiences and knowledge students are bringing in? And this is really probably the clearest example of how we need to make sure higher education is much more open to what is outside of the building of higher education, or the higher education institution, let's say. Those are the four models in a very, very short presentation. I think we can just end with one major point, which is all of this requires some kind of homework on the part of any of us who are involved in higher education. And I've started a list of the kind of homework topics, and you can see I've extended this list slightly in a blog I did recently, which will link also to this presentation. I think the first one I've already mentioned. We need to focus much more on learner guidance. We haven't been very good at this in the standard system. The more flexible we get, the more inclusive we want to be, the more guidance we need. So I would actually argue guidance should become part of the educational enterprise and not something separate where we only go to guidance when we have problems. We also have to think much more about collaboration between different types of learning providers. This is how also we will enable flexibility, but we can also look at quality assurance and recognition. Of course, if we want to keep higher education also much more aware of what's happening on the labour market now, but also in 10 and 20 years, because we want graduates of higher education to have a good transition into the labour market now, but also to be learning things which can be changing the labour market and changing society. For all of that to happen, we need a closer relationship to representatives of the labour market. All of this flexibility means we have to think of recognition better. We have to think of how we document what people are learning, where they're learning it, and we have to think really beyond just the simple idea of credit points, I think. This credit points has got us to a certain step. I think it's good, but maybe this over-formalization into workloads is going to be a limitation when we think of better recognition of some elements. Of course, we're going to have to think of quality assurance. Quality assurance until now has been very much institutionally focused. Quality assurance then has to think much more closer to what is the educational provision being given, being offered to the learner? How can the learner make the right kind of decisions on whether this is something which is going to be useful and good for them? And then, of course, we have to think of two major elements, which is how do we fund higher education? Again, this has also been very much based on institutional funding until now, and has been based on some very simple concepts of what we consider student success. So many of the performance-based models at the moment focus on graduate numbers. By focusing on graduate numbers, you focus on a kind of a norm of what a study could be. And finally, we have to think also about whether we need to change student aid, because student aid is often also tied to some very specific norms of what higher education is. And therefore, things like you can't change your study area very often, you have to study within a particular time, you have to study a certain amount of hours to still have this student aid. So we have to rethink this as well. So all of these are the kind of homework we need to do if we're going to take on the learner perspective. Thank you very much for your attention.